I was on the river a few summers ago. I was trying to catch some big cutthroat, but the fish were just ignoring my dry flies. Someone on the river was like, hey, why don't you try twitching that big old hopper pattern? Maybe that's what'll get the fish to strike. And I just looked at him and I was like, well, why would I do that? Don't I want like a perfect drag-free drift with my dry flies? Well, I listened to that guy that day and I started catching tons of fish. Today on Untangled, we're going to talk about why sometimes you got to go ahead and break those rules.
This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company.
Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durrant. Got the camera issue fixed. So for those of you who watch along on the YouTube, we're back with a good camera angle, good video quality. The Pony Express finally made it to Wyoming. We got a wonderful little show put together and lined up for all of you today. But first, got a big announcement to make because it's episode 21, and this is where we're going to announce the winner of our fly tying mega kit. So we need some kind of a drum roll, please. And our winner is Trent Nielsen from Utah. Trent, congratulations. We are going to be in touch with you ASAP. We're going to get that kit out to you. Thank you, seriously, to everybody who took the time to submit questions and be part of this community that we're building here at Untangled. And in case you're concerned about not, winning something like this isn't the only giveaway we're going to do. All right, we've got other things in the pipeline for the show. So stick around, keep listening. There will be chances to win wonderful stuff in the future. But Trent, congrats. You got the mega kit. We'll be getting that out to you ASAP. And I think that's kind of about it. I know that I said previously that this was going to be the big show with Alex, and we were going to be talking everything we could about fly rods. Well, I got postponed because one of the kids, see, this is one of the downsides to teaching. And there aren't as many as the public would make you think. There's a lot of good with teaching, but one of the downsides is when them kids get sick, you as the teacher, you get sick too. So I've been battling back from being really, really sick. Alex and I are going to do our podcast on fly rods next week. So that's going to be episode 22 coming at you. So just a little update on that, just switching things around. Alex decided he didn't want to come do the show when I was coughing up a lung. Something about not wanting to get sick either. I just think he didn't want to make the trek up to Wyoming is what it comes down to. But he's going to be here this weekend along with Berkeley. It's going to be a great time. Well, I will stop my yammering, and I'm just going to jump right into the questions. We had some really good ones come to us this week. Chris from New Jersey starts us off. Chris writes in and says, "Hi, really enjoy listening to this podcast. I do get a lot of useful information from you. My question is, I am starting to use a dry dropper method for fishing. Do you usually tie a few rigs in advance to save time? If so, what is the best way to store/carry them? Thanks for your help." Chris, really, really good little question here. To my knowledge, there's not really a way to tie up a dry dropper rig beforehand and have them ready to use unless you're storing them on like a foam pad in your drift boat. I will do that sometimes in the boat. I know a few guides who will do that. They'll leave like a big dry fly and a nymph tied up, and they'll just stick it on the foam pad in the boat. I think that might be the only place that I've seen like pre-tied dry dropper rigs put together. It's just kind of screaming to be tangled, so you don't really want to try to go through the headache of storing and carrying them. Plus, you're going to be tying that dropper to meet different depths anyways. Now, if you're fishing the same water all the time and your water level doesn't fluctuate, then I guess you could kind of get away with it. But you're going to be changing things up so much that pre-tying, it might sound like it'll save you time, but in the end of the day, it probably won't save you a whole bunch of time. And something that I do think is worth remembering that your question kind of reminded me of, Chris, is that I don't think we should rush through fishing too much. You mentioned saving time on the water, and I think when we start to look at our fishing that way, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice, to be honest with you. We're supposed to enjoy the heck out of our time out there on the water, right? That's our time to just go out and enjoy the process of going fishing. And I know we talk about the fish and we focus on the fish so much, but fishing's not all about the fish. It's about the process of going fishing, the simple act of going fishing in the first place. Some of my favorite days on the water have been days where the fishing really wasn't all that great, but I saw something amazing. I saw some amazing bighorn sheep on one trip out in Utah. And I'll never forget, I got so close to them because I just rounded the corner on the trail and they were right there, like 15, 20 feet away. Never been that close to a wild bighorn before. And I just sat there because I didn't know if like one of the rams was going to come up and headbutt me. And then I was going to have to hike all the way back and explain how, I got a hole in my stomach or waders. Oh yeah, I got gored by a bighorn sheep. Yeah, I'm a tough guy. I didn't know what the protocol is for approaching a wild bighorn. And so I just sat there on the trail and watched at him. And to be honest, I don't remember how the fishing was that day. I'm sure it was great. It's usually great on that little stream that I was on where I saw these bighorns, but I don't remember the fishing. I remember those sheep though. And I think the more and more that you fly fish, the more and more you're going to have experiences like that for yourself where you just start to appreciate the experience of being out on the water. It's something that is in shorter supply just as things get busier. I fish less now than I did before I bought a house. I'm sure any homeowner can attest to that. I just cleaned my gutters yesterday, and the whole time I'm doing it, I'm sitting there thinking, man, couldn't I pay one of my students to do this for me? And then I thought, well, I don't know that I want them to know where I live, so I'm just going to go ahead and keep doing it myself. But, things get in the way. Life gets in the way, right? We're just supposed to enjoy that time out on the water, not rush through it. And rigging up, that's part of it's just the time on the water. Plus, the more and more you rig up, Chris, the quicker you're going to get at tying those dry dropper rigs, and it's going to go quicker. You're not going to notice it too long. Re-rigging is not going to take as much time as you feel like it does now, and it's not taken away from your time on the water. So I didn't expect to get on a soapbox like that to start the show, Chris, but thank you for giving me that opportunity. I appreciate it. Good question. Thanks a bunch. All right, our next question comes to us, Miles from Massachusetts. Now, I don't know if this is our first question from Massachusetts, but I feel like it is. I feel like it's the first one. So, Miles, congrats on being the first from Massachusetts to write into Untangled. I appreciate it. Miles writes in, says, hello, Spencer. This is my second question submitted to your show. Well, Miles, you're not the first. Well, maybe you were the first from Massachusetts. Oh, I appreciate your time put into this and also your dad joke sense of humor. You're darn right you do. Finally, somebody's appreciating it. My students don't appreciate it. My wife appreciates it. She's about as bad as I am with the dad jokes. Anyways, I'll shut up and get through your question. Don't worry about me visiting Wyoming for fishing. I've been out there once to fish a long time ago as a kid dunking worms, and returning to your state with a fly rod is definitely not on my bucket list. I have a question about fishing terrestrials and dry flies for trout. I like using fly and conventional tackle for largemouth bass where subtle movement is important. This experience is giving me a terrible time with dry flies for trout because I am constantly fighting the urge, usually unsuccessfully, to twitch or wiggle the fly. In what situations, if any, should I try to move a dry fly or terrestrial for trout? Would it vary by trout species, moving water, still water, season, anything else? Please help me fix this bad habit I have developed. Well, Miles, I teased this topic in the hook for the show, right? And this is the one where I kind of want to dig in and really dissect your questions. That's what we're going to do. I'm going to go ahead and answer your question with a story and then come back through and kind of explain that a little bit. So, this was a while ago. I got a really good friend of mine. His name's Blair. He lives in Idaho Falls. Heck of a good fisherman. Real good looking too. I mean, if I can end up with the physique of Blair, the body of a Greek god, then I've accomplished something great in life. And I really hope Blair listens to this episode. Anyways, he and I were out in western Wyoming. We were fishing on this river out there. This is before I even moved to Wyoming. And the river is really well known for being a haven for cutthroat trout. We were fishing, and it was a perfect day. Just blue skies. We saw moose, no bears. Just about anything you could want for it. It was like middle of July, so there were plenty of bugs hatching. The river was calmed down from runoff. Like, it doesn't get better than that day, but we got our butts handed to us. I mean, we fished all day, and I think Blair caught like 2 whitefish, and I was skunked. Complete goose egg on the day. It was getting to be really frustrating because when the river looks that good and you're doing everything right, you start to almost feel like you deserve a fish. And I mean, you'll learn real quick in fly fishing, you don't deserve jack squat. You get whatever the river gives you, but it's hard to not feel that way some days, right? Well, Blair and I decide to swallow our pride. So we go into town and we go to the fly shop and we say, hey, what are we doing wrong? And one of the fly shop guys is like, well, are you using this? And he holds up Chubby Chernobyl, my favorite terrestrial pattern, really the only terrestrial pattern I fish. He holds it up. I was like, yeah, I've got a whole bunch of those. I've been fishing those and a couple droppers all day. He looks at me, says, well, cut off all them droppers. Throw this fly out there and twitch it. And I looked at him. What in the devil are you talking about? Twitch it. He says, well, you got to do just what I said. Just twitch it. And trust me, you're going to catch more fish than you know what to do with. So I said, all right, I tip my hat. Me and Blair go back to the river. We pull off. We get down to a good looking run. We throw a cast up there. And I watch Blair. He twitches it. And he twitches it. And this cutthroat comes up and dump trucks that Chubby Chernobyl. Just hits it like it stole something from him. Okay. And I'm sitting there like, what is going on? We're supposed to have a dead drift. We don't want any movement. Well, think about it for a sec. We're fishing hopper imitations or something that imitates a terrestrial insect, right? You throw it out there on the water. They don't just sit still the way aquatic insects do they? No, they don't. If you ever watch them when they end up in the water, they're struggling like mad to get out of the water. They don't want to stay there. Mice, if you ever see a mouse get into the water, they don't just sit there and drift with a perfect drag-free drift. No, they're making a wake. They're getting the heck out of Dodge because they don't want to be in that river. Same thing with a terrestrial insect. It gets in there. It doesn't want to be eaten. It's trying to get out of the water. As soon as me and Blair started adding that subtle little twitch to everything that we were doing, night and day difference in what we were catching. And the guy at the fly shop was 100% right. We caught more fish than we knew what to do with that night just by adding that tiny little twitch. The key here is to look at how those bugs move naturally. I touched on that a second ago. Not every bug, you're not going to want to twitch every pattern, right? I'm not going to try and twitch a blue-winged olive. Even though they flutter and move, if you watch them, I've got a good friend of mine on Instagram. His handle is Green River Fly Fisher. And if you watch his videos of rising trout, he has the best footage of rising trout that I've ever seen. He's phenomenally talented. Amazing guy. His footage of those rising brown trout to all the mayflies out there on the Green River right now. Yeah, those bugs are moving and twitching and whatnot. But there's not really a whole lot of drag on them. If you watch the water around them, there's not the wake that you would see from twitching like a terrestrial or a hopper. Okay. So you're not going to want to twitch like your mayflies, right? Maybe your caddis, and we'll get to that in a sec. But the bugs that are going to have some kind of natural wiggle to them or natural movement to them anyways, just by virtue of what they are, those are the bugs. Yeah, not a bad idea to add a little bit of a twitch to, especially if you can't seem to get those trout to come up and get a look at them. Try twitching it a little bit. You never know what's going to happen. And that really kind of segues into another point that I wanted to make here is that I've caught tons of trout by skating a dry fly. And I'm sure a lot of us have. If you think back to it, how many times have you kind of swung your dry fly across the top and watched a fish come up and smack it for no reason? Or you think there's no reason to it. Well, it's hard to say for certain what that fish was doing. Why is it coming up to eat on the swing? Kind of your likely thing is, well, it looks like an emerging insect and they just want to jump after it. A piece of wisdom that I heard from a very well-renowned guide once, he said, trout really love food that's trying to get away from them. There's just something about food that's trying to get away from them that trout love. So maybe that's why. Maybe it triggers something in the trout, that skating fly. It's hard to tell for sure why they take a fly that's skated, especially a dry fly, right? It makes sense to swing like a wet fly, a soft tackle. That makes sense why they would take that. But the why of that doesn't matter so much as we've probably all seen that happen. We've probably seen that fly skate and had a fish at least come look at it. Maybe we didn't catch it, but we've had a fish come hit it. Sometimes you got to skate a dry fly. That's just what the situation calls for. You're never going to know unless you actually try it. I would say that it is worth trying to add a little movement to flies on freestone streams more so than like a tailwater or spring creek, just because most tailwaters and spring creeks tend to have a lot lower, or not lower, slower and clearer water. So the fish have a lot more time to inspect your fly. They're going to be very wary of something that doesn't look natural. On the freestone, fish have to be a little bit more opportunistic, and that vision of the bug getting away from them, it might trigger that instinct in them a lot more than it would on your calmer water. So a little bit of movement wouldn't be a bad thing. To sum this all up, you're going to want to add some movement to your terrestrials. That's definitely not going to be a bad thing. Not a ton, all right? Just a few little twitches. And when I say twitch, like just move the rod tip a tiny bit. You don't want to twitch it like you're stripping a streamer. Just pop your rod tip almost like you're jigging a little bit. Just make that fly wiggle. Make that hopper pattern wiggle. And I bet you'll see quite a few more fish come up to your hopper patterns this summer. Miles, thanks for the question. I really appreciate it. All right, Joe from New Hampshire. We are really hitting the northeast part of the country on this show. That's kind of cool. Joe from New Hampshire, he writes in and says, hey, thoughts on a whip finish versus a couple of half-hitch knots when finishing a fly? I've used both, mostly whip finish. Wanted to hear others' thoughts on this matter. Thanks, Spencer. You're an entertaining man. P.S. Coke Zero. Well, Joe, it's okay that you're wrong about Coke Zero versus Diet Coke. We can't all be right all the time. That would be a really tough burden to bear. But thank you. I'm glad I'm entertaining. I'm glad somebody's laughing at me or with me. I would hope it's with me. I get laughed at work. That my students definitely laugh at me, and hopefully all y'all are laughing with me. This is a fun little question here. I like it. I hadn't really done a whole lot with like thinking this through before. So it was nice to have the opportunity to do a little research and talk to a few folks about this. The difference between your half hitch and your whip finish when you're tying flies, it's really pretty simple. A half hitch only uses one wrap to hold down the thread. A whip finish uses multiple wraps. So in theory, multiple wraps to hold your thread down is going to be a little bit more secure than the single. than the single wrap that you get with a half hitch. So kind of have to lean towards the whip finish. The whip finish there. I've always used a whip finish just because that's how I was taught to tie flies, and why change it now? But from what I gathered, I looked on quite a few forums, talked to a few other anglers, fly tiers. The whip finish is preferred because it's generally seen as a little bit more durable, and a whip finish will create a smaller, more tapered head on your fly. I don't know how much that head shape really matters in the grand scheme of that fly's fish catching abilities, but it does make a difference in how the fly looks to you, or if you're trying to sell them, or if you're giving them away as a gift. It's going to make a difference there. I would personally recommend going the whip finish route, just because, like I said, that's what I've used, and I do think it is a little bit more durable than the half hitch. And again, I did peruse a few forums and talk to a few folks I know who tie quite a bit, and the consensus among them was, the whip finish it's the superior knot, but I'm not saying that if you tie your flies with your half hitch and finish them off, that those flies are going to be inferior or not as good for some reason, right? We're not going down that route here. It's just, if I had to pick, I just go with the whip finish. So hopefully that clears up and answers some of that for you, Joe. Thank you for the question. All right, just like that, we are at the last question of the show. So thanks everybody for coming along on today's episode. Really appreciate it. Last question, Chris from Pennsylvania writes in and says, Chris from Pennsylvania here, loving the podcast. I've been fishing my whole life, but made the switch to fly fishing about 2 years ago, and I never looked back. I recently got my youngest brother hooked on it as well. Bad pun intended. Chris, you're a man after my own heart there. And his first fish on the fly was as wonderful, albeit stocked brookie pictured below. This weekend we were out and in a mayfly hatch of massive bugs I'd never seen before. You could clearly see them land on the water, watch them float for a second or two, and just get crushed by rising fish. I managed to pick one up, had to be a size 6 or 8, look yellowish green, and of course I had nothing close to the color or size because honestly, my dry fly collection isn't very robust. Knowing you've preached that color isn't always what the fish key in on, I found the biggest Adams pattern I had and the biggest dun I had that looked exactly like the bugs coming off but was the wrong color, and maybe only a size 10 or 12. We managed to land about 6 to 8 fish, missed a few more rises, but had a fun day of dry fly fishing, all said and done. It was my brother's first few trout on a dry fly, so he was absolutely thrilled, and it was a proud big brother moment for me as well. My question pertains to entomology. Do you have any recommendations on books or online resources for hatch charts and more information on identifying and anticipating the hatches of different bugs? I can't help but think if I had known what mayflies might have been hatching this time of year, I got a few bigger mayfly patterns, we could have had an epic day, not just a good one. As a novice fly fisherman, I've honestly just never seen mayflies that big coming off, so I was woefully unprepared. Thanks for your help and tight lines. Chris, I love the story, man. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm really glad you got to put into practice something I've preached. See, I have some students who listen to this show, so I'm going to get on a soapbox for a minute. To any of my students, okay, Mr. Durrant's English students that are listening to this show, I hope you realize what happens when you actually listen to what it is that I've got to say. All right? Chris listened to what I had to say, and he had a banner day of dry fly fishing. All right? You listen to what I say, maybe you won't fail my class this semester. Oh, no, that's awesome, Chris. Thanks a bunch. I love the story. Thank you for sharing all that with me. Color really is the least important thing. Just like you noticed here, your experience actually highlights that because you caught a fish on a fly that was a close enough match to what was coming off. Now, it sounds like you got into one of those like holy grail hatches where it's just it's the kind of hatch that we all dream about where the fish are going nuts and any decent drift is going to put you into a fish. Those hatches are wonderful. And when the fish are keyed in that much, that is one of those rare instances where the color can really be a deciding factor in whether the fish take your fly or not. It sounds to me like the bigger factor here for you was the size. The naturals were pretty big. You said like a 6 or an 8, and your biggest Adams was like a 10 or a 12. That's going to make a difference. All right. If you'd had like a size 8 Adams kicking around, which I don't know why anybody would, if anybody's got a size 8 Adams in their fly box right now, honest to goodness, you're not joking me. Let me know. I'd be real curious to know. But if you'd had that and you threw it on, then yeah, there's probably a good chance. Even if you'd had like a stimulator, for example, like a size 8 stimmy, yeah, you probably would have done a little bit better. So the size was right, but or the size wasn't right, but you nailed the shape part because you saw they were mayflies, and that Adams has that perfect tapered body, looks an awful lot like a mayfly body, right? It's just a good imitation of what a mayfly body should look like. You really did just kind of follow that and just match the hatch as best as you could, which really is, I mean, you couldn't have done better in that situation if you tried, Chris. That was really good. And I'm glad that you shared that with us because it's great to get some external validation that I'm not just making stuff up here, right? It really is. This is how it works when you get out on the water. This is how things are going to go. And you guys are going to see that Chris did. So wonderful, wonderful experience. Now, as to your big question about entomology, local fly shop, that is going to be your absolute best bet. All right. They are going to have the pulse of what the local hatches are better than anybody else. An example of that, here in Wyoming, we have a really, really early BWO hatch, like in February. And I've never lived anywhere that has a BWO hatch that early. Usually I don't start to see blue wings until mid-April, if I'm lucky. Some years you might see a few sputter off in March, but that's like, you got to really be just hoping for the best thing in the world at that point to happen. I mean, you have to have been saying your prayers, going to church every Sunday to see a good blue wing hatch in March on the rivers that I fish. Okay, that's just for where I lived in Utah. But this blue wing hatch here in Wyoming, I found out about it almost kind of by accident. A guide keyed me in on it. But I never would have thought on my own to be like, hey, I'm going to go fish blue wings today. It's middle of February and it's been 14 degrees for a month. I'm going to go fish these mayflies. I never would have thought that if it hadn't been for someone keying me in on it. And that same kind of on the ground info is what you're going to get out of a fly shop. I did find like a decent hatch chart for Pennsylvania. I'll go ahead and link that in the podcast description for you, just in case you need a jumping off point. But that's what I would do, man. Just study these hatch charts, and keep in mind too that our hatch charts are going to show you like the very local flavors to certain rivers and whatnot. Another example, back in Utah, there was an awesome little stream near my place where I lived there, and there was a great salmon fly hatch on that stream. Wonderful salmon fly hatch. Nobody else knew about it or fished it. That was the best part. I'm sure other people knew about it, but I'd go in the middle of the week when nobody else was fishing, and that really helped. But I found those bugs hatching just on that stream. I never saw them on another stream in the area, which is really interesting. And you might run into something like that on your local rivers where you're at in Pennsylvania, Chris. So that's where the fly shop knowledge is going to come in. And I say all this to preface what I'm about to say with there's a general sort of ebb and flow to hatches that you can count on. So year round, you're going to have midges. Okay, any major hatch in the winter is likely going to be midges. Early to mid-spring, you might see some blue wings or some mayflies coming off, usually blue wings. And then you start to see some salmon flies pop up, your earlier salmon flies like squallas. And then you start to see the caddis come up, and then the salmon flies, and then maybe the yellow sallies, if you have them in your area. The PMDs kind of start coming off there in early summer. And then you've got kind of that smorgasbord of bugs, your caddis and mayflies that are coming off all through summer. Trichos in some places, you'll get them towards later in the summer. And then when things wind down, you start to see your fall mayflies and your fall caddis hatches. And then you're back to midges in the winter. So that's kind of like your big overall look at it. That's not always set in stone everywhere, but that's kind of a good way to kind of gauge what you're going to be running into out there on the water. So hopefully that was helpful. Thanks to everybody listening to the show all the way through. Really appreciate it. Having a wonderful time doing this. And remember, episode 22, Alex and I are going to be chatting fly rods, everything you need to know about fly rods. So you definitely don't want to miss that episode of the show. Really appreciate everybody who takes the time to write in their questions. That's what keeps the show moving and so much fun to do. Until next week, everybody, tight lines.